Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, visits the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta, Georgia, and explores the life and career of our 39th president.
That is good. Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, we've gotten word through another country that that Nabab in Iran has stated that he stated at 8:13 this morning that he would inform them when the plane leaves. So I presume that is the first message we've had from Iran, that the plane will be leaving.
President Jimmy Carter, on his last morning in office, still working to free the American hostages from Iran, just a few hours before the swearing-in of his successor, Ronald Reagan. We'll show you more of this video later on tonight, as well as other rare behind-the-scenes footage, shot as these pictures on your screen now from the historic Camp David Summit, which was shot by the U.S. Navy film crews who were allowed behind-the-scenes access to some of the Carter administration activities. And there you see a picture of some of the stacks at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum in Atlanta. We'll be taking you there throughout the evening to hear from some of the staff and look at some of the documents and artifacts from their collections. Joining us again in our Washington studios, Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian. What's Jimmy Carter all about?
Oh gosh, well, Jimmy Carter's a unique figure in the presidency in many ways, and yet I think tonight you'll find out how contemporary a figure he is. Many of the issues that he dealt with are certainly with us today. If you look at energy, the Middle East, terrorism, the whole debate over the America's mission in the world, the attempt to balance the pursuit of human rights with the protection of national interests. These are evergreen issues that Carter dealt with, in some cases, I think, more successfully than people perhaps think in retrospect. One of the unique things about Jimmy Carter is that in some ways his ex-presidency tends to overshadow his presidency, and I hope maybe tonight we can rebalance that a little bit.
The U.S. Navy shot a lot of video during the time that Jimmy Carter was president, and actually the Carter presidency reduced the number of people working on it to 3. But one of our first videos of the evening is this ad. What's it from?
The first historic thing that Jimmy Carter changed was how to run for president. And he really made the Iowa caucuses what they are today. He had 2% name recognition at one point in 1975, but he believed he could win beginning in Iowa, and I think we're about to see an ad from that campaign.
Meet Jimmy Carter.
$1,503. Here's a man who knows the answer. Well, I'm good to see. You know, everybody from Congress that's running for president is a lawyer. I don't have anything against lawyers. My oldest son is a lawyer. But I think it's time to have a non-lawyer in the White House for a change. Somebody that's had to work with his hands, someone who has had to run a complicated business, somebody who has actually had to manage the affairs of a large government, as I have in my own state. Hi. Jimmy Carter, good to see you. Oh, I don't want to take your money. In fact, I want to cut your taxes, as a matter of fact.
Last year, there were 24 people in this nation that made over $1 million in income that didn't pay 1 nickel in income tax.
It's a big job, think about it.
I know it's a big job, but I think I can handle it.
It's a big job, think
We now have in the federal government
you help me, okay?
the worst, most confused, bloated, overlapping, and wasteful bureaucracy that human beings have ever created.
There's no way to get an answer out of Washington, no way to understand what's going on there. You've got 1,900 agencies and departments in Washington. That needs to be chopped down to no more than 200. When I was elected governor, we had 300 agencies and departments in the Georgia bureaucracy. We abolished 278 of them.
Jimmy Carter unscrambled a bureaucratic mess as governor. He can do it as president. As a working man, Jimmy Carter understands the needs of working Americans, and he'll make our taxes fair. Vote for Jimmy Carter.
We go from that ad in 1975 to a video of Jimmy Carter out on the campaign trail in 1975 and 76. Richard Norton Smith, what impact did Jimmy Carter's campaign back in 76 have on future presidential campaigns?
Well, first of all, Carter ran a brilliant campaign. The conventional thinking was, this is a former one-term governor of Georgia. No one really knows who he is. You know, what are his claims to the presidency? It turned out that 1976 was the perfect environment. He ran as an outsider, not an ideologue, maybe a moral ideology, someone who promised to restore trust, to bring government closer to the people. He ran against Gerald Ford from both the right and the left. You heard the populist Carter in that ad, and you heard the efficiency expert Carter in that ad. What he did in terms of transforming how you get elected really began with the Iowa caucuses, and to use Iowa as a springboard to generate a lot of national visibility, to live off the land. It is unbelievable. Of course, the irony is that his success in doing it has made it 30 years later impossible to repeat what he did then, because you no longer can come from nowhere. It's tougher for a dark horse with no money, with very little organized backing, to pull off the kind of out-of-nowhere surprise that Carter did.
For the last 7 years, Jay Hakes has run that Carter Library down in Atlanta, Georgia. On your screen in just a moment will be a live picture. Mr. Hakes will join us for the rest of the evening. And one of the things that I remember personally that got a lot of attention way back in that 76 campaign was a November 1972 memo written by Ham Jordan. Jay Hakes, what was in that memo?
Well, we have it right here, and it was basically a master plan for the whole campaign. It was 58 pages, and it described how to deal with George Wallace, how to deal with the early states, and we can take a look at it right here. And the first sentence says, "This memorandum is an attempt to set forth in a logical fashion some specific thoughts and recommendations on your national effort." And then here is the date that you referred to, November 4th, 1772, which is almost exactly 4 years before the presidential election. We are celebrating today the 31st anniversary, because November 2nd was the 76th election.
Who was Ham Jordan?
And then Ham Jordan was an associate of Carter's in Georgia, had run his campaign for governor, and he was the one that wrote these memos and ran the presidential campaign. And he was somebody that most people in Washington hadn't paid a lot of attention to, but when you read these memos, you see some very sharp thinking at work.
Right behind you are some of the stacks. Tell us something about the library and what's your mission there?
Well, the main thing we do is protect and make available to researchers the papers of the president. We have 27 million pieces of paper. We have generally in a normal working day 3 or 4 people here researching those papers. We also have a museum that is open to the public, and the other important part of our mission is public programs and education programs. We have a lot of authors come in to speak at the library, and we have a lot of students come in with their teachers.
What difference does it make to you that you have a former president living and active and working in that library and museum, and how often does he come to the Carter Center?
Well, it's a terrific advantage for him, for us, because President Carter and Mrs. Carter are here in Atlanta 1 week a month. They're usually down in planes or often traveling around the world. So we actually get to see them in the library from time to time. Mrs. Carter fairly recently spoke to the winners of the History Day competition, which was a great inspiration to those students. I really like it when President Carter speaks to teacher groups, because he talks about how important his teacher was to him, and they come all charged up and ready to go. And then quite recently we had President Carter here as a researcher. He's working on a book right now that will come out next spring on his mother, and he was here in the library doing research. So it was a little disconcerting when the other researchers came in and there was President Carter doing research.
We have a brief clip, Richard Norton Smith, coming up from the Iowa caucus comments of Jimmy Carter in an interview in 1999. Let's watch that.
It was not until Johnny Apple, surprisingly to us, New York Times, went out in the countryside in Iowa and talked to people, you know, teachers and policemen and I guess bartenders and others, and he sized up what we already knew about Iowa and wrote a headline in the New York Times. Did the other reporters ever dream that I might come in first in Iowa? They were looking at me as coming in fifth or sixth because they very seldom got out of Des Moines. They would stay there, you know, and enjoy themselves and talk to each other. But he actually went out and got opinions from people around the state, and he projected that I was going to win, which I did. This amazed a lot of people, and it focused attention on me, which is very beneficial.
It's from a Jimmy Carter interview with C-SPAN back in 1999. Of course, Jimmy Carter would go on to win the 1976 Democratic nomination and face President Gerald Ford in the general election. Here we're looking at pictures from their first debate. Don't see it on the screen. We see actually a T-shirt. There's the first debate. Richard Norton Smith, people today expect that presidential candidates will debate each other, but it wasn't always so, was it?
No, it was not. In fact, the first and most famous debates of the television era in 1960, the Kennedy-Nixon. And then there was a long dearth, 16 years. And the only reason we had debates in 1976 was because the incumbent was trailing the challenger by upwards of 30 points during the summer. And so you almost had this role reversal, where Gerald Ford, who after all was living in the White House, challenged the challenger to a series of debates. Governor Carter accepted, and there were 3, and they were significant.
The Vice President, Walter Mondale.
Yeah, Walter Mondale provided, in many ways, the perfect balance. Jimmy Carter was an outsider of Washington, former governor from Georgia. Walter Mondale was Hubert Humphrey's protege, with strong ties to organized labor and the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and of course he'd been a senator. But beyond that, there was also real compatibility between the two men. Walter Mondale was a preacher's son from a small town in Minnesota, and I think from the beginning he and Carter just clicked. Also, remember, Mondale had not run in '76. He famously said he really didn't want to spend all those nights in Holiday Inns. And so when Jimmy Carter picked him to be his vice president, he knew he wasn't picking a rival. He was picking someone of whom he could be very confident of his loyalty. And the other thing is, Walter Mondale, in many ways, is the first modern vice president. That's because he and Jimmy Carter reached a very significant agreement where Mondale would not be sort of given a specific assignment here or there, like Lyndon Johnson, the space program. He would be, in fact, second in command.
Carter Library Director Jay Hakes, you work for Walter Mondale. What's this vice presidential memo of understanding that we read about in years past?
Well, Walter Mondale had some reservations about accepting the vice presidential position, and he talked with his good friend Hubert Humphrey about the subject. Hubert Humphrey, of course, had been vice president for Lyndon Johnson. And he made some suggestions to Carter about how the vice presidency ought to operate along the lines that Richard suggested. And there was actually in December of 1976, during the transition, a specific memo that was drawn up. I think Dick Moe actually wrote up the text of that agreement. And it said that Walter Mondale would be involved in all national security matters, that he would be meeting regularly with the president. They were going to integrate their staffs, which I don't believe had ever been done before. So this memo sort of established what became the new vice presidency. And I think all vice presidents since have benefited to some extent from that memo, because it gave them a clearer and more important role to play.
Richard Norton Smith, the walk up Pennsylvania Avenue, which those of us old enough to remember, had an impact on the country.
It did. It was an inspired bit of symbolism at a time, again, when the imperial presidency was all too fresh in people's minds. The fact that the new president and first lady would get out of their car and, in effect, mingle with the American people walking down Pennsylvania Avenue was important. It was by no means the only symbolism. It almost deliberately recalled Jefferson's inauguration, when he left his boarding house and walked to be sworn into the office. Carter was a frugal man, and I don't think you'll begin to understand the Carter presidency if you don't see it, among other things, as an attempt to reposition the Democratic Party as a centrist party, an economically responsible party. He mothballed the presidential yacht, the Sequoia, and he also eliminated chauffeurs for the White House staff. That was just, those were a couple of many symbolic gestures that he made to define himself during the opening days of his presidency.
If perchance this is the first time you've seen one of our Friday night programs on presidential libraries, we have been to each one in chronological order. There are about 3 to go after this one. And tonight's special guest with Jay Hakes, who runs the library and museum down in Atlanta. And Richard Norton Smith has joined us for each one of these. And you also have run 4 presidential libraries?
Yeah.
When was the last time you ran one, and which one was it?
Well, the Lincoln, which is outside the NARA system, a couple years ago. But before that, the Ford was the last, and left there in 2001.
Jay Hakes, what did you do before your now 7-year run at that library down there in Atlanta?
I was the head of the Energy Information Administration, which is the data and analytic part of the Department of Energy. So I've kept a strong interest in energy, which sort of fits in with the Carter presidency.
Mr. Smith, next up, March 16th, 1977, first town hall meeting. What was it?
Well, this is very much a part of this sort of opening salvo to redefine the presidency, to make it less imperial in its trappings, to make it closer to ordinary people. This is a town hall meeting in Clinton, Massachusetts, where basically the president stands up and takes questions from the audience.
This is 3 minutes long. Let's watch.
In the aftermath of Watergate scandals and other related scandals in our government and throughout our government, I was wondering what you could do as the president now, what we could do as a nation of people to restore the moral fiber of our country, to restore the basic faith of our people in you as the president and the presidency that you hold, in the government as a whole. It seems that so many of us have heard so many promises through the years from politicians, but really we kind of get dismayed at times and wonder what really can be done and what will be done.
Well, that's a question that I tried to answer during the campaign. And to summarize, the only way I know that we can restore the trust of the American people in public officials is for the public officials to be trustworthy, to tell the truth, and to make sure that there's a closeness and an intimacy between leaders who've been elected and the people who put them in office. This is something that's crucial to me. I mentioned earlier in my talk that I think that the American government ought to stand strongly for basic human rights, whether it's in Northern Ireland or whether it's in other parts of the world. The human rights issue is one that no single president can solve successfully, but one voice, particularly the voice of the American president, can set a standard for the world to start thinking about. And I believe that over a period of time we'll accumulate a deep concern for human beings, for the right of individuals to make their own decision, not to be tortured, not to be punished. Also, I think that the openness of government is important. I've had so far, and I will have as long as I'm in the White House, a full-scale press conference at least twice a month to let the very knowledgeable Washington news media cross-examine me, quite often with live television and other coverage, and ask me the most difficult questions they can contrive. I'll do the best I can to answer them. And on my radio call-in show a couple of Saturdays ago, I had 42 American people who got through to me. 9.5 million tried to call me, and I'm sure that a lot of them were listening. About 24 million people listened to that program. I don't claim to know all the answers, but you know, I want the American people to know that there's a partnership. And as I closed, I guess, 1,000 speeches during the campaign by saying all we need is a government that's as good and decent and honest and truthful and open and compassionate and is filled with love as are the American people. I know it by heart. And I believe if our government can measure up to the people, we can do that.
As we look at some more footage on the town meeting Rick Smith. How well did President Carter do with this idea of bringing the people closer to their government?
Well, I think he certainly deserves credit for trying. I mean, I think he made an honorable effort. I think it's almost impossible to achieve perhaps what he hoped to, in part because, among other things, in between the president and the people, you have something called the media. And presidents find it increasingly difficult to speak directly to people without being filtered or interpreted and sometimes diverted by that fact.
Jay Higgs, what's your take on this?
Well, it's a very interesting system that they used when they traveled around the country. They would put coupons in the newspaper, and anybody could fill out a coupon and mail it in, and then there would be a random drawing to select who was going to get into the town meeting. I saw in the Clinton, Massachusetts clip that Governor Dukakis was there. I don't think he probably had to fill out a coupon. But for the average person, they had an equal shot to get into the meeting. The Carter administration did that for 3 years, and it was one of the casualties of the Iranian hostages. Once that happened, he didn't travel much after that, and so that sort of brought an end to the town meetings.
Mr. Higgs, part of the People's Program of Jimmy Carter were fireside chats. Explain how often he did them and what was his goal?
Well, it was similar to the town meeting. He wanted to communicate directly with American people. He was clearly trying to emulate Franklin Roosevelt's chats on radio and adapt it to the modern television era. And the Carter people like Jerry Rafshoon, his communications guru, was very aware that the TV ratings were larger at night for something like a fireside chat than they were for even an inauguration, which was during the day. And it was sort of a work in progress because the first fireside chat was the one he did in a sweater, and they were kicking back and forth what they were going to do, and it turned out to be about energy. But I have here a document. If you look at it, and point number 9, this was a conversation that Stu Eisenstadt had with Carter, and energy was only number 9 on the list. It was a brief analysis of the energy problem. But during those first 2 weeks of the presidency, there was a decision made that energy was going to have to be a lot more important, and that was going to be the major theme of the first fireside chat where Carter wore his cardigan sweater.
Let's look at 4 minutes of that first fireside chat.
One of our most urgent projects is to develop a national energy policy. As I pointed out during the campaign, the United States is the only major industrial country without a comprehensive, long-range energy policy. The extremely cold weather this winter has dangerously depleted our supplies of natural gas and fuel oil and forced hundreds of thousands of workers off the job. I congratulate the Congress for its quick action on the Emergency Natural Gas Act, which was passed today and signed just a few minutes ago. But the real problem, our failure to plan for the future or to take energy conservation seriously, started long before this winter, and it will take much longer to solve. I realize that many of you have not believed that we really have an energy problem, but this winter has made all of us realize that we have to act. Now, the Congress has already made many of the preparations for energy legislation. Presidential Assistant Dr. James Schlesinger is beginning to direct an effort to develop a national energy policy. Many groups of Americans will be involved. On April the 20th, we will have completed the planning for our energy program and will immediately then ask the Congress for its help in enacting comprehensive legislation. Our program will emphasize conservation. The amount of energy being wasted, which could be saved, is greater than the total energy that we are importing from foreign countries. We will also stress development of our rich coal reserves in an environmentally sound way. We'll emphasize research on solar energy and other renewable energy sources, and we'll maintain strict safeguards on necessary atomic energy production. The responsibility for setting energy policy is now split among more than 50 different agencies, departments, and bureaus in the federal government. Later this month, I will ask the Congress for its help in combining many of these agencies in a new energy department. to bring order out of chaos. Congressional leaders have already been working on this for quite a while. We must face the fact that the energy shortage is permanent. There is no way we can solve it quickly. But if we all cooperate and make modest sacrifices, if we learn to live thriftily and remember the importance of helping our neighbors, then we can find ways to adjust and to make our society more efficient and our own lives more enjoyable and productive. Utility companies must promote conservation and not consumption. Oil and natural gas companies must be honest with all of us about their reserves and profits. We will find out the difference between real shortages and artificial ones. We'll ask private companies to sacrifice, just as private citizens must do. All of us must learn to waste less energy. Simply by keeping our thermostats, for instance, at 65 degrees in the daytime and 55 degrees at night, we could save half the current shortage of natural gas. There's no way that I or anyone else in the government can solve our energy problems if you are not willing to help. I know that we can meet this energy challenge if the burden is borne fairly among all our people. And if we realize that in order to solve our energy problems, we need not sacrifice the quality of our lives.
On the screen is the same sweater that President Carter was wearing there in that speech from the White House, that fireside chat. Rick Smith, when you watch this today, all these years later, what's your reaction?
The more things change. Do you know what oil was a barrel when the president made that speech?
No.
It just spiked enormously because of the OPEC generated shortages, $34 a barrel. And I don't know, can a crisis be a crisis after 30 years? I don't know. But, you know, the very fact that later on in the evening we're going to listen to the famous Malaise speech, which is 2.5 years after this first fireside chat. And it was supposed to be a speech about energy, and the president decided no one was listening to him. So it illustrates again that for all of the power, particularly the power to communicate and to control the nation's agenda that we like to ascribe to the modern president, there are severe limitations. And this issue, perhaps better than any other, illustrates what they are.
Jay Hakes, when Jimmy Carter was in the Navy, one of his bosses, big bosses, was Hyman Rickover. And I understand you have a memo there from the Admiral to the President. What's it about?
Yeah, let me set the stage. Carter, in that clip that we just saw, promises that he's going to have a comprehensive energy plan ready in 90 days. And it turned out that that plan had 113 components to it. So he and James Schlesinger, who was his energy advisor, were discussing, well, how can we sort of describe this so that people can understand it? And if you look at this memo from Admiral Rickover, who was someone who had a big influence on Carter, he comes up with the following language. He says, always when our country has had to engage in war or an emergency, we have been willing to make sacrifices for the common good. The energy situation that lies before us can be considered as the moral equivalent of war, except that we will be uniting our efforts to build, not destroy. And you can see in that memo, Carter has underlined it, and of course that did end up in his speech, and that speech was known as the moral equivalent of war speech. Unfortunately for Carter, some of his critics started calling it the Meow speech, because MEOW was the acronym for moral equivalent of war. But that plan today, if you look at it and all the components of it, was quite remarkable, and actually a fair amount of it, and I'd say most of it, did get adopted by the Congress.
One of our purposes for doing these programs is to show you these libraries and also show you how you can go do research. There's all kinds of memos that are tucked away in the stacks in these boxes, and we're looking for some treasures, and have been for the last year, that we've never seen before. The idea is to show you that there's a lot more in these libraries and museums than people know about unless you go in there and stick your hand in some of those boxes. You've got another, but before I do that, let me just say that to our audience that phones are going to be open here. You can begin dialing now if you want to participate. We'll have the numbers on the screen. That's Jim Schlesinger there next to President Carter. You can see the numbers for Democrats, 737-0001, Republicans, 737-0002, and Independents, 628-0205. We'll go to calls in a moment. But Jay Hakes, you've got a solar panel memo there. What's that pertain to?
Well, just as Carter got the energy legislation passed late in '78, there was a revolution in Iran that cut off oil supplies from Iran, and so it forced the country to look back again on what to do about energy. And Carter put a lot of emphasis in that year on solar. But I have here a memo that is about the solar water heater that eventually went up on the White House roof. And Carter writes in the upper hand corner, this is Carter's handwriting here, and I should point out that this was a frequent trait of President Carter, which historians really like. He would write annotations in the margins of memos, and it's a great insight into presidential thinking. And he says, Hugh, I prefer small H2O heating system, maybe east or west wing, must not be eyesore, check with me. And this was a year before the solar panels went up on the White House roof, but it was a real symbolic thing for these solar hot water collectors to be on the roof of the White House. Carter, put a lot of emphasis on that.
If you listen closely to what Jimmy Carter says in this clip that we're about to show you, he'll make a prediction for the year 2000 on what will happen to those solar panels that are on the White House roof, in this case in 1979. This is about 3 minutes and 45 seconds.
Solar energy will not pollute our air or water. We will not run short of it. No one can ever embargo the sun or interrupt its delivery to us. But we must work together to turn our vision and our dream into a solar reality. Today I am sending to the Congress legislative recommendations for a new solar strategy that will move our nation toward true energy security and abundant, readily available energy supplies. This solar strategy will not be easy to accomplish. It will be a tremendous, exciting challenge to the American people. A challenge as important as exploring our first frontiers or building the greatest industrial society on earth. By the end of this century, I want our nation to derive 20% of all the energy we use from the sun. Direct solar energy and radiation and also renewable forms of energy derived more indirectly from the sun. This is a bold proposal, and it's an ambitious goal, but it is attainable if we have the will to achieve it. Government action alone cannot make this goal come true. It will require a concerted effort of all of us. Government at all levels, industry, labor, business, inventors, entrepreneurs, architects, builders, homeowners, concerned citizens, all working together. If we do not learn to eliminate waste and to be more productive and more efficient in the ways we use energy, then we will fall short of this goal. But if we use our technological imagination, if we can work together to harness the light of the sun, the power of the wind, and the strength of rushing streams, then we will succeed. In this, as in all major national programs, of course, the federal government can be a catalyst for change. I'm proposing a coordinated government-wide effort using all the tools at our disposal to spend more than $1 billion in fiscal year 1980 to stimulate solar and other renewable forms of energy. In the year 2000, the solar water heater behind me, which is being dedicated today, will still be here, supplying cheap, efficient energy. A generation from now, this solar heater can either be a curiosity, a museum piece, an example of a road not taken, or it can be just a small part of one of the greatest and most exciting adventures ever undertaken by the American people, harnessing the power of the sun to enrich our lives as we move away from our crippling dependence on foreign oil.
Richard Norton Smith, as you can see on your screen, it's a museum piece. What does that mean?
Well, because the solar panel is a museum piece, we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that the entire Carter approach to energy belongs in a museum. The fact of the matter is, it's woven into the warp and woof of our lives. It's in auto mileage standards and speed limits and the appliances that we use and the houses that we buy and the autos that we drive. The fact is, and of course there is the Federal Department of Energy, but it's easier to create an agency than it is to change public attitudes. Carter's talking about behavioral modification, not just moving boxes around on a chart. And if you look at the numbers, by the time he left office, by the early 80s, there was actually a period when there was an oil glut, when domestic consumption rose, and when our dependence, which was about 48% on foreign oil, actually sank to about 40%. So in the short term, at the very least, that solar panel notwithstanding, a good deal came out of the Carter Energy Program.
Carter Library Director Jay Higgs, show us a couple of those cartoons you have there on energy.
Yeah, we always like to go back and look at the cartoons because they both amuse us, but they sort of let us see how people were thinking at the time. And I have one here that shows Jimmy Carter as Moses, and he's coming down from the mountain with his energy plan. But instead of listening to him, the people are worshiping at the idol of the golden car. And then the other one is pretty similar in its tone. Jimmy Carter is building an ark, and the ark is the Carter Energy Program, and people are kind of laughing about it. But as Richard said, it's kind of a mixed bag. We were getting 7% of our energy from renewables at the time, and today we're getting 7% from renewables. So we never got to the 20% goal he was talking about. But as Richard pointed out, there was a sharp drop-off in the imports of oil. Some of that goes back to the Energy Policy Act passed in 1975 when Gerald Ford was president. Some of it could be attributed to Reagan finishing the price decontrol that Carter started. But there was an awful lot of activity in the Carter years. And by the early 80s, we had actually defeated OPEC. They were having to cut back their production so much that they had lost control of the world market. The problem is that we're now importing 3 times as much oil as we were in 1982. And once we had sort of figured out how to lick the problem, we sort of quit working at it.
Ripley, Tennessee, our first call for this hour. Go ahead, please.
Hi, this is Robert Morganwilde, and I just wanted to say, watching President Carter speak that 30 years ago, I'm struck because of how much he was honest to the American people. He told them what he wanted to do and why we needed to do it, and I just wonder if there is any way that we could ever have that kind of president again. I've never seen one like it at age 56. Where when he said something, we knew what he was going to do, we knew what he felt about it, and I never see that anymore. And I'm just wondering what your companion there on this great program and this series would have to say about that. We just don't see it anymore, and I think he was an uncommon man.
Mr. Smith.
Well, I think the caller speaks for, I suspect, millions of people, whether it's Jimmy Carter, and frankly, there are admirers of Ronald Reagan who could say the very same thing. Every 4 years, we sort of articulate an ideal and wonder when it's going to come along. And once in a while, we elect them. But as I think the Carter presidency demonstrates, there's kind of a sobering lesson in what happens.
Baraboo, Wisconsin. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hi. I realize Jimmy Carter's had a number of years to sit back and reflect on all of this. And I'm a little concerned that this gentleman, this president of ours, former president, has taken the opportunity to go around the world and speak against our current sitting president. I'm a little concerned about that, in that it's making foreign policy extremely difficult for all of us out here in the public to understand and hold high, because imagine that we're a little confused while the rest of the world is really in turmoil.
Jay Higgs, what do you say about that caller?
Well, different presidents have had different styles. There were some presidents who only would communicate their views on foreign policies through phone calls to the president, and many others who spoke out publicly. I think one thing that we might keep in mind is in the rest of the world, we sort of model democracy to them when we have vigorous debates in this country and a good public discussion. So I think the caller certainly raises a point, but I think there are different ways to look at it.
Long Island, New York. Good evening.
Yes, hello. My question is for Richard Norton Smith.
Right ahead.
Yes, I just want to congratulate you on this series, and I'd love to just follow you around. You could just babble on.
Oh. Historical babble?
I just was doing this series and going through the presidential libraries. Have you yourself come across anything that kind of surprised you, or, hey, I didn't know that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, you know, before I was ever a director at the libraries, I was a researcher. And I think every library I ever went to, and I've been to most of them, for researching books, I found surprising things. I'll never forget digging up at the Hoover Library, before I was director, a gentleman who was a Secret Service agent in the Hoover White House. And buried in a diary was an account of Calvin Coolidge's reaction to the news of Herbert Hoover's nomination. Remember, Coolidge had said, "I do not choose to run," and he was at the summer White House, I think it was in Wisconsin. And on the day that Hoover, his not particularly liked Secretary of Commerce, was about to be nominated, Coolidge withdrew to his room with a bottle of Green River whiskey and did not reappear for 24 hours.
Invert Grove Heights, Minnesota, you're on.
Hi, thanks for the call. I'm in a political affairs course at the University of Minnesota with Professor Jacobs and former Vice President Walter Mondale. And we've been discussing in class a lot of events such as the Iran-Contra, Camp David Accords, Treaty of Taiwan. And you've already mentioned the closeness of the Vice President and the President. I was wondering if you could describe a little bit more, how comfortable was President Carter in sending his Vice President to China instead of going himself? And I was also curious if you had any personal correspondence at the library between the Vice President and the President.
Caller, before we get an answer from Jay Higgs on this, what's he like to have in class, Mr. Mondale?
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm a future history teacher, and every week coming to the class, I'm just inspired by what he has to say. It's such a unique perspective to get such an insider's perspective of different events and situations. He's extremely outgoing, and he seems to be very overjoyed to be teaching us. And we are extremely excited to have him teaching us.
Thanks for calling, Jay Higgs. What about that China trip that he took?
Well, let me say first that Vice President Mondale came down here to work on declassifying his national security papers, and we said, "Are you working on a book?" And he said, "No, I'm getting ready for the class I'm teaching at the University of Minnesota." So those students, he put a lot of work into that class, and they're getting access to these previously classified documents. I think it's fair to say President Carter had confidence in Walter Mondale to do anything that he was not able to do himself. And he used him a lot for the diplomacy in Africa, along with Andy Young, to work on majority rule in South Africa. I think he had a lot of confidence in him in China. Even though China was a big, big issue for the Carter administration, he and Mrs. Carter did not actually get there till after they left the White House because of the Iranian hostages. But I think he had complete confidence in Mondale on every aspect of government.
Last call for this segment, Rochester, New York. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to ask Richard Norton Smith if Ronald Reagan had won the 76 Republican presidential nomination, do you think President Carter would have defeated him by a greater margin than he did President Ford? And how come you don't have President Carter on tonight? Are you going to have any of the future living presidents on future shows? Thank you.
Oh, the question about 76, boy, you know, that's speculative. I won't even call it speculative history. I don't know. To be very honest with you, I really don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure there is an answer to that. You can certainly spin out a scenario where Reagan was much more politically potent in 1980, I think, than he was in '76. In a curious sort of way, I think the campaign, although he certainly ran forward a very close race, I think in the end, maybe the reason he lost was because of some of the perceptions that, ironically, because of age or Hollywood or whatever, or right-wing sympathies. I think a lot of that had actually been neutered by 1980. Reagan was actually a stronger candidate, in part because his message had more resonance contrasted with the perceived failings of the Carter administration.
The reason why you don't see a president on who's alive, obviously, he's alive, never mind. The reason you don't see, we didn't ask them. We've asked them for some behind-the-scenes discussions about the library and things like that, but this is really a program about the libraries and about research and about looking for the treasures inside these libraries. We always welcome a past president anytime they want to talk about this. We need to move on to the Panama Canal.
Yeah, boy, you know, I'll tell you, whatever else you say, you certainly cannot say that the Carter administration ducked the tough ones. This is both a foreign policy question, but one with enormous repercussions for domestic politics. This is one of the real buzzsaws. And in fact, I believe as President Carter here talks about, he was by no means the first American president called upon to negotiate a treaty that would relinquish American sovereignty over the canal and the canal zone.
This is from a '98 interview that C-SPAN had with President Carter.
It was more difficult for me to get the Senate to ratify the Panama Canal treaties than it was to be elected president. It's the most difficult political challenge I've ever had in my life. It was a very controversial issue that was acknowledged to be necessary, beginning with President Lyndon Johnson. And then he and President Nixon and President Ford all promised to have the Panama Canal Treaty negotiated and passed. They all backed away because it was so politically charged with animosity. I went ahead and negotiated the treaty and presented it to the Senate. And it was like pulling teeth, or even worse, to get 2/3 of the members of a U.S. Senate to vote in favor of ratifying that treaty. Had they not done so, we would have undoubtedly had a war in Central America. It was the most courageous action, in my opinion, that the Congress has ever taken. Of the 20 senators, for instance, who voted for the treaty, who were up for re-election that same year, 1978, only 7 of the 20 came back the following year. And the attrition rate was almost as great 2 years later, because the people that were against the Panama Canal treaties were so dedicated and vehement and angry about it that they launched crusades to defeat any senator who voted in favor of the treaties.
Richard Smith, not only the president there talk about the animosity, but when we did a call-in show with the president back in '99, 1/3 of our calls came in on the Panama Canal Treaty debate.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, it touched a raw nerve. I think it's probably still a raw nerve among many, because I think it's so wrapped up in emotion and symbolism, particularly on the right. It came to be seen as a symbol of American decline, that somehow we were voluntarily ceding this 10-mile wide slice that Teddy Roosevelt had orchestrated 100 years ago. And in fact, it was the Panama Canal Treaty, arguably, that brought Reagan as close as he came to Ford in 1976. So President Carter is absolutely right. It was, in many ways, I think it is almost the origins of the modern conservative movement can be traced to that treaty and the debate that it touched off.
Jay Hakes in Atlanta, what can you add to this?
Well, one collection in our archives that's very interesting are the legislative files that were kept by Frank Moore. And in there you will find the record of almost every call that President Carter made lobbying members of Congress, what the congressman said, and what you see for the Panama Canal is maybe the most intense presidential lobbying effort in history. We have here just one sheet that I think is kind of interesting. This is his attempt to lobby Senator Stevens of Alaska. And the memo that's sent to President Carter says the senator is a hard-bitten political realist who has told Baker, that's Howard Baker, he will not support the treaties. Baker still believes he can get Stevens, however. And then at the bottom you can see Carter's handwriting on the note, which is what he tells his staff after he's talked with Stevens. He says, we'll go back and rethink. Kissinger and Ford have called him this weekend. And one of the things that I think I take out of that memo is that here's 3 Republicans that are helping him try to get the votes he needs, the very difficult votes he needs to pass the treaty. Howard Baker, Henry Kissinger, and Gerald Ford.
We can squeeze in a couple more calls this hour. Let's go to Athens, Ohio. Go ahead, please. Hello, Athens. Athens, are you there?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking my call. And I just want to say Jimmy Carter makes me really proud to be an American, and especially in regard to his efforts and to deal with the Middle East conflict in a fair and even-handed way. But I want to ask Richard, you know, as far as a historian, is there one president who has more respect worldwide than another president?
It depends when you ask that question. It's a fair question. You know, 50, 60 years ago, probably Woodrow Wilson's name might have been held in great regard. Maybe not among the leaders, or the monarchs, or the prime ministers, but among ordinary people who looked to Wilson and his symbolic leadership. In fact, I think there are connections between Wilson and Jimmy Carter in a lot of ways.
In a moment, Jay Hicks, I want to look at that Nobel Peace Prize that Jimmy Carter won, but first let's go to Ocala, Florida. You're on the air.
Thanks, Brian. How are you tonight?
Good.
Brian, I'm a fellow Midwesterner. I'm calling you from Central Florida. You're in Indiana, Hoosier. I'm an Illinois Abraham Lincoln guy. I was going to ask Richard Norton Smith. I'm 49 years old. I worked for President Carter with a dual chain of command with the United States State Department as a young Marine in Central America. And actually was promoted to NCO, as we Marines would say, by Monty Lucy Jaramillo, who was the Dean of Linguistics from University of New Mexico and a political appointee of President Carter. And I was very proud to serve with Carter. And I asked one of my young Marines when President Carter was up for re-election, I said, and his father had been an Army officer, and mine had been a Marine corporal in Korea. I said, Mike, why don't you consider voting for President Carter? Since you're from Birmingham and I'm from Abraham Lincoln's hometown, I said, you know, most of the people that my parents grew up with here in Illinois thought Ronald Reagan wasn't even really much of an actor, but I think President Carter has a nuclear physics degree from the Naval Academy. And the older I get and realize, the closer I pay attention to international relations, how proud I was to serve with President Carter. And when Reagan came in, and there were many questions about the taking over the American embassy in Iran, who actually may have helped those students, may have been some of our own citizens, and then maybe the actual Beirut bombing has some questions that a lot of Marines are not aware of. So I'm very proud to have served with President Carter. I think he's really a man of the times. And Dr. Smith, could you explain his education to us? I'll hang up and listen.
Well, sure. We know from a boy he was a great reader. He attended college in Georgia. His great ambition was to go to the Naval Academy, which he realized, and indeed he was a protege of Admiral Hyman Rickover, which tells you something in and of itself. He was involved in the nuclear submarine program, and he gave that all up when his father died in 1953, and much to the protest of his wife, he decided that they would move back to planes. Jimmy Carter probably has as formidable an IQ as any American president. But beyond sheer intelligence, there is a kind of intuition that the presidency requires. But politics is more an art than a science. And I think that is something that may be eluded President Carter.
Jay Hicks, can we see that Nobel Prize, and when did he win it?
Absolutely. He won it in the year 2002. And I'm pointing here to the Nobel Peace Prize, and we had it on display here in the museum within 14 days of when he received it, which was very nice of him to give it to us so soon. But you'll see next to it another medal, and a lot of people don't know that the winners of the Nobel Peace Prize get 3 medals. They get 1 gold and 2 bronze. And when I was talking with President Carter about how people might be able to see both sides of the medal, he said, well, I'll give you a gold and a bronze. So we believe we might be the only place in the world where you can see both sides of the Nobel Peace Prize at the same time. We also have the Martin Luther King medal that he won in 1964. It's just a mile and a half down the road. And you might ask, well, where's the other Carter medal? And that's at Plains High School, which is part of the Carter Historic Site run by the National Park Service in Plains, Georgia.
San Antonio, Texas, you're on the air. Please go ahead.
Good evening. This is Richard Turner calling from San Antonio. I'm a retired history teacher, and I'm so glad I read Jimmy Carter's book, which I have in front of me, called An Hour Before Daylight. And in the book, he has one sentence he quotes, "Despite its small size, with fewer than 300 students in 11 grades, our Plains High School was superb." He goes on and on in this section of his book to talk about Miss Julia Coleman and other people who had a great impact on him in his formative years in high school. And I'm wondering if that's reflected anywhere in the library, besides his presidential papers, that there are documents about his past, his development in high school, and his community development that made him the kind of person that he really became.
Jay Hicks is not on the line at the moment, so I have to come back to that question maybe later. Do you happen to know?
I don't, but I suspect that that there are.
David Stanhope is a supervisory archivist. He'll be on your screen in just a moment at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. And David Stanhope will show us some things that we've never been seen before. Let's go to Syracuse, New York next. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm curious why the president seems to get a raw deal on Iran. The fact was, when they took over, they basically took a westernized country and knocked it into the dark ages. You got college students taking over the embassy, and they basically cut the country off from the rest of the world. And I don't think any president could have done very well in that situation. It seems like, of all the things, I'm not a very big fan of Jimmy Carter. He really doesn't seem to get credit for handling an impossible situation that Reagan, just by virtue of election, seems to get credit for.
Well, you know what? It's interesting you say that, because in a nutshell, in some ways, Jimmy Carter is almost too rational for the irrational world of politics. And my God, if anyone was irrational, it was the folks who had not only taken over the embassy in 1979, but had taken over Iran.
David Stanhope has been at the Carter Library for 22 years, and you've got some things that we've never seen before. Show us.
You're right, Brian. We have quite a treasure that we've just received from President and Mrs. Carter. About 2 weeks ago, President and Mrs. Carter invited us down to their home in Plains to survey and pick up a collection of family photos. This collection spans approximately 100 years of Carter family history, has political photos in it, family photos, and celebrity photos. And here I'll just show you a few. Here's President and Mrs. Carter with, or I should say Governor and Mrs. Carter with Governor Wallace and his wife. It's taken approximately 1970. Here we have a photo of President Carter with Greg Allman of the Allman Brothers. Greg Allman was a big fan of President Carter, and the Allman Brothers Band put out a couple of fundraising concerts. One of my favorites that I've just seen is Mrs. Carter with Elvis Presley. I think this was taken after a 1974 concert in Atlanta.
I understand you also have a scrapbook that we've never seen before.
Yeah, this is an old, fragile scrapbook that President Carter's mother, Miss Lillian Carter, kept of President Carter's grade school years. As you can see, it's very fragile. It's one of the reasons that we don't have it out or have never displayed it. As you can see, here's some penmanship exercises, Jimmy practicing his J's. She also pasted a couple of photographs here. Here's a photo of his class, and here's another photo of his class, and they're all wearing Halloween masks.
How big a scrapbook is that? There's Miss Lillian on the screen. How big a scrapbook is that?
Oh, I would say it's probably got about 100 pages. It's in very fragile shape right now, and one of our biggest concerns here over the next couple of years is to go ahead and try to conserve this as much as we possibly can so future generations will be able to share in the knowledge that it provides for history.
We're going to come back in just a few moments with a look at foreign affairs, the Camp David Accords, also the Iranian situation. But this 2-hour program is at the halfway point. We're going to take our couple-minute break and join us again. We'll have some more phones.
You're watching C-SPAN's Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, a unique look at 12 of America's modern presidents, using rarely seen film and video, revealing a new perspective of these men. Tonight's program will continue in a moment, and you can watch this program in its entirety later here on C-SPAN at 11 p.m. Eastern, and hear more about tonight's president with additional audio recordings and interviews with noted historians. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio, XM Satellite Radio Channel 132. And for more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries.
Next Friday, the C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, will be live from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, taking viewers behind the scenes with Ronald Reagan from the 1985 Geneva Summit with Mikhail Gorbachev to the White House during his last 48 hours as president. We'll also get a glimpse of the young Ronald Reagan before he took to the political stage. The program will also include viewer call-ins. Live next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN.
I wish we had been in a position that after the overthrow of Saddam, we could have reduced our forces, reduced our presence in the country.
Sunday on C-SPAN's Q&A, former UN Ambassador John Bolton on his new book, Surrender is Not an Option, Defending America at the United Nations and Abroad.
I confess, with the benefit of hindsight, it would have been better to let the Iraqis run their own traps rather than our trying to do it for them.
John Bolton, Sunday night at 8 on C-SPAN's Q&A. You can also listen to Q&A on C-SPAN Radio, exclusively on XM Satellite Radio. It's also online as a C-SPAN podcast.
Now we continue with our visit to the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta, Georgia.
Back to part 2. On your screen are pictures from Camp David Summit in September of 1978. This was shot by the U.S. Navy film crews who were allowed behind-the-scenes access to some of the activities during those meetings. This rare archival footage is part of the collection found in the Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta that we're featuring tonight. Richard Norton Smith, what are we going to see in this final hour of tonight's program?
Well, we're going to look at a high point of the Carter presidency, which is on your screen right now, certainly the process leading to and flowing out of the Camp David Accords. We're going to look at the low point, which is the prolonged crisis involving the American hostages in Tehran. And we're going to look at a defining moment, arguably the most important speech Jimmy Carter made, which has inaccurately gone down in history as the malaise speech.
We talked to Jody Powell on the phone. Jody Powell was his press secretary, and what's this clip going to show?
Well, actually, Jody Powell is probably the aide who was closest to Jimmy Carter. They first, I believe, became acquainted during Jimmy Carter's 1970 run for governor of Georgia. And during the long, lonely months in 75 and 76, often there were just the two of them together, bunking in supporters' homes. You know, a shoestring campaign, living off the land, and I think that relationship became even closer. So there's no one who is better qualified than Jody Powell to talk about this. Actually, what we're going to see, I think we're going to see and hear him talk about this unprecedented summit at Camp David in the fall of 1978, when the president decides against all odds and considerable advice to take on the intractable Middle East.
Jay Hakes, by the way, has told us that the Navy shot some 12 hours behind the scenes. Very little of it's been seen by the public. So let's listen to Jody Powell and look at some of the Navy footage.
It was clear that President Carter was taking a risk by involving himself directly in a set of negotiations, very high-profile negotiations, where there was absolutely no guarantee of success. And probably the odds makers would have said more chances of failure than success. But I remember when someone, as we were discussing inviting Sadat and Begin to Camp David, I remember when someone said, Mr. President, if you if you do that and you fail, it could mean war. It could mean the end of your presidency. And President Carter said, well, if we don't do it, if we don't try it, and things continue to slide downhill, and what's likely to happen then? And they said, well, it probably means war. And he said, well, then I guess we better take the chance. I don't think there's any doubt that all three leaders wanted this meeting, this set of negotiations to succeed. And there was a great effort on everyone's part to try to provide the best possible atmospherics to encourage success. Unfortunately, when it got right down to it, after the first few days, it was clear that President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin were just two very different people, and they tended to rub each other the wrong way, to use a colloquialism. And it was concluded by President Carter that it would be best if they did not have to negotiate directly with one another, and so he acted really as a bit of shuttle diplomacy between the Begin cabinet and the Sadat cabinet at Camp David, and that was how the agreement was eventually, after many days, concluded. One of the things that we hoped to prevent was having the chances of success lessened because of public statements back and forth from the two parties in the course of the negotiations, which locked them into positions, statements that often in the past had been made primarily for consumption and for political support back home. And so President Carter very forcefully asked both sides to refrain from making public statements. And they agreed. Now, that was not totally honored. There were some cases where people on background briefed reporters from both sides, but it was kept to a low rumble at best. And I think there's no doubt that keeping these disputes that occurred, and some of them were quite intense, as we all know now, there was a point at which President Sadat had concluded that all was lost and he should go home. If those sorts of things had bubbled to the surface and become a matter of public discussion, I think it's very likely that there would have been no Camp David treaty. Well, President Carter had been to Gettysburg earlier, just because of his, as almost, I suppose, every Southern boy has, an interest in the Civil War and the terrible battlefields in which that conflict was fought. And it occurred to him that taking these two men there as an excursion, as a break from the negotiations, but also as an example of our own bloody conflict, and an example of how those who fought and killed each other with a tremendous emotion could, at the end, come back together and live in peace for 100+ years thereafter, might be an effective way to go. You never know exactly whether that works as well as you thought, but people on both sides who made that trip have said, particularly on the Egyptian side, that seeing that field at Gettysburg and hearing of what happened there did have an emotional impact on the principles. Well, the signing ceremony, which was, I suppose, for those of us who were there, a little bit anticlimactic because the crowning moment, and it will be one of the most joyous moments of my life, was when we learned that an agreement had been reached, because 24 hours earlier it seemed very likely that there would be no agreement and that the negotiations would end in failure. And we were already in the process of beginning to block out a speech for President Carter to the nation and to the world, explaining his view of what had happened and why it had failed, and what the next steps needed to be. But it was truly a wonderful and joyous occasion.
Richard Norton Smith, what do you think Anwar Sadat or Menachem Begin would think if they were still alive today with what's happened since 1979?
I suspect Sadat would be disappointed. I don't know about Begin. I think, in a sense, the next chapter in this story is the backsliding that took place almost as soon as both men left Camp David, and particularly Begin. I think it's no secret that President Carter found Begin the more difficult to negotiate with, and there was perhaps less chemistry there. But I think they might both be disappointed that what began so promisingly at Camp David seems to have ground to a halt, and in some cases reversed.
The director of the library in Atlanta, the Carter Library, is Jay Hicks. He's been joining us all evening long. You have a Carter Camp David briefing book there. Could we see it?
Yes, this is one of my favorite documents. It's a very detailed briefing book that was prepared for President Carter before they went to Camp David. As you can see from the markings here, it was classified, and only in the last few years has it been declassified. But I think my favorite part of it is here. And the State Department says, here in the type section, it says, best from our viewpoint would be both sides ready to sign a document like the joint agreement at tab 3, but that seems an unlikely outcome. And as is kind of typical from Carter documents, he writes his own view here in the margin, and he says, this will be our firm goal. So he was pushing much harder than his advisors to try to get a big agreement here. I have another document here, and this is President Carter's handwriting on the Sinai Agreement. And the reason I think it's important is that we have maybe 100 pages of yellow pads of Carter's personal journals and writings from the time at Camp David. He kept very detailed notes because he wanted to hold all the parties accountable. If they agreed to something and later tried to renege on it, he'd say, well, here in my notes it says such and such. And then perhaps the most important page was the framework for the Sinai Agreement, which shows Carter's very detailed knowledge of the area. And basically what it was swapping land for peace. The Israelis returned the Sinai Peninsula to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians agreed to recognize Israel and have trade with Israel. And that basic agreement has existed up to the current time.
Richard Smith, what's the background on President Carter's trip to the Middle East in 1979?
Well, in effect, it's the necessary sequel to what happened at Camp David, because, as I say, almost as soon as that summit wrapped up and the document was signed, remember, there wasn't a peace treaty. This was an agreement that everyone hoped would lead to a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. But the more time went by, the further they got from the spirit of Camp David on both sides. It was, frankly, showing signs of unraveling.
More of the U.S. Navy footage we'll see, and more from Jody Powell explaining this trip.
The trip to Cairo and Jerusalem the next year after the Camp David summit was even more risky than the summit itself. The Egyptians and Israelis had not been able to conclude the negotiations to actually write a treaty of peace and a blueprint for moving forward from that. And that we were once again faced with a situation in which progress had been made and expectations were high, but things had begun to unravel and looked like that we were headed toward disaster and maybe another war. And President Carter characteristically said, well, we can't let this happen. I've got to take my best shot, which he felt was, and he turned out to be correct, placing his prestige on the line and going to Cairo and Jerusalem. In some ways, the process was similar. That 24 hours before the end, we all thought were very likely to end in failure. And it may have been that in both cases that both parties, the Egyptians and the Israelis, had to look failure in the face and contemplate what that would mean before they were willing to make the necessary steps to ensure success.
I didn't have too much of an argument with my advisors about bringing Sadat and Begin to Camp David. The biggest argument I had with my advisors, it got kind of ugly, was almost a year later when I decided to go to Jerusalem and Cairo, because it made me so vulnerable. You know, here was a president traveling all over, halfway across the world, and failing was much more politically damaging and embarrassing to our country than going to Camp David and having those other two leaders coming in and failing. You know, I don't know how to express it exactly, but I was out on a limb, literally and figuratively. I was way out on a limb. That was a major argument. But again, I thought that we'd reached a point of extremis where it was either do that or fail. Once I made a decision like that, I was awfully stubborn about it. I think if I could have one political attribute that had been the cause of my success to begin with, it would be tenacity. Once I get set on something, I'm awfully hard to change, and that may also be a cause of some of my political failures. I just can't say for sure.
Could be.
It's not stubbornness. It's not always an attractive attribute.
Voice of Jimmy Carter. And just a couple weeks after that trip to the Middle East, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat came to Washington to sign a peace treaty between the two countries. See it on your screen. These are the pictures of that event shot by the Navy film crew. Dr. Smith, it's almost 30 years later, and Israel and Egypt are still somewhat at peace. Where does this fit into Jimmy Carter's legacy?
Well, I think it's probably the most identifiable part of his legacy. At the same time, I suspect for him, it's not a source of pride so much as a source of unfinished business applicable to the entire region. And I think that is something that has almost obsessed him for 30 years. One very sobering thought. This is arguably his greatest triumph as president, and yet if you look at the polls, it produced no measurable upsurge of support for the president.
Jay Hakes, what's your take on this?
Well, to follow up on that point, several days after the signing on the White House lawn, they had the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island. So even though that picture of the signing is one of the most iconic pictures in presidential history, it didn't make the cover of Time or Newsweek. But on the bigger picture of legacy, I think the Panama Canal Treaty really rivals Camp David in some ways, because in that case, it really improved American relations in the region. It brought a rebirth of democracy throughout Latin America, was very, very successful. I think the legacy of Camp David is it shows a mechanism by which you can take two parties that are about as far apart as you can imagine, and if you use good conflict resolution techniques, you can bring them together. So I guess what the real legacy of Camp David would be, can that be replicated in other situations?
Museum curator at the Carter Museum is Sylvia Naguib. She has been there now for 20 years, and she's got some new, or not new, but some documents to show us that were connected with all this Middle East negotiations. What do you have?
Yes. Yes. This piece, we have about 40,000 objects in the museum collection. About 100 are on display at any one time. And many of them are gifts to President and Mrs. Carter and Amy Carter. And this one is a piece that was given by Prime Minister Begin of Israel to President Carter. And as you can see, it's a beautiful calligraphy of Psalm 126, both in English and in Hebrew. And Prime Minister Begin quoted Psalm 126 in its entirety in his remarks after the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty signing. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy, and expressing the joy of his nation at this time of making a peace agreement.
What about the Order of the Nile?
Yes, this piece, the Order of the Nile, was given to President Carter by President Sadat of Egypt. And It was given actually in Egypt when President and Mrs. Carter visited to try to reinvigorate a languishing peace process after the Camp David meetings. It's beautiful in gold with enamel and stones. And it's also a token, it's the nation's highest honor that is given, but it was also a token of a personal friendship between President Carter and President Sadat.
At this time after this far after your presidency, what kind of things are coming into the museum there that maybe haven't been put on display yet?
Well, we still receive things because President and Mrs. Carter are still traveling so active all over the world. So we still receive items. This particular item here was given. Amy was 9 years old when the Carters moved into the White House, and this piece was given by the children of Sri Lanka. It's a little ebony elephant with silver, beautifully done. And not only was this elephant given, but a real live elephant named Shanti was given, and Amy received her on behalf of the children of America.
What is that right behind you, that painting?
This painting is indicative of many of the portraits and pieces that we have in our collection, created with a great sense of exuberance and admiration for President Carter. This was painted by a Romanian artist who was living in Italy at the time, and shows President Carter in quite an unusual manner. We're not quite sure of the symbolism of all of this, but we see Jimmy Carter, we see the globe representing perhaps his protection of the world. We see the word Pax, which is Latin for peace, and a rendition of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. So perhaps this artist is portraying Jimmy Carter as a peacemaker, defender of human rights, protector of Europe. But if anything, it's about hope in the Carter presidency.
Sylvia and Naguib, thanks for joining us this evening. Richard Norton Smith, time to switch to another subject, a new subject, as we only have about 38 minutes left in this program on Jimmy Carter. What's next?
Crisis of confidence? Okay. This is another summit, if you will, at Camp David, perhaps the most unusual in modern times. 2 weeks after negotiating a SALT II agreement in Moscow with Leonid Brezhnev, the President and Mrs. Carter were looking forward to spending a few days in Hawaii. And no sooner had they arrived there than he got an emergency call from Pat Goodell, his pollster and sort of House intellectual, who said, "You've got to come home. You have no idea how bad things are." He came home. He was going to give the 5th energy speech, televised speech of his presidency. And they had concluded, the President concluded that no one was listening anymore, which is interesting because there may be a relevance between then and now in terms of how does a presidency in crisis get out of that crisis. So he decided to cancel the speech. He went to Camp David for 10 days. He brought in a cross-section of Americans, sat on the floor, took notes, listened to their criticisms, their suggestions, their ideas, and wrote a speech, which was partly about energy, but was much more about a crisis of confidence besetting the American people.
Let's watch this July 15th, 1979, 4.5-minute segment with Jimmy Carter on the crisis of confidence speech.
10 days ago, I had planned to speak to you again about a very important subject, energy. For the 5th time, I would have described the urgency of the problem and laid out a series of legislative recommendations to the Congress. But as I was preparing to speak, I began to ask myself the same question that I now know has been troubling many of you. Why have we not been able to get together as a nation to resolve our serious energy problem? It's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession. And I realize more than ever that as president, I need your help. So I decided to reach out and to listen to the voices of America. I invited to Camp David people from almost every segment of our society, business and labor, teachers and preachers, governors, mayors, and private citizens. And then I left Camp David to listen to other Americans, men and women like you. It has been an extraordinary 10 days. These 10 days confirmed my belief in the decency and the strength and the wisdom of the American people. But it also bore out some of my long-standing concerns about our nation's underlying problems. I know, of course, being president, that government actions and legislation can be very important. That's why I've worked hard to put my campaign promises into law. And I have to admit, with just mixed success. But after listening to the American people, I have been reminded again that all the legislation in the world can't fix what's wrong with America. So I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation. I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. I do not mean our political and civil liberties. They will endure. And I do not refer to the outward strength of America, a nation that is at peace tonight everywhere in the world, with unmatched economic power and military might. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. The confidence that we have always had as a people is not simply some romantic dream or a proverb in a dusty book that we read just on the 4th of July. It is the idea which founded our nation and has guided our development as a people. Confidence in the future has supported everything else. Public institutions and private enterprise, our own families, and the very Constitution of the United States. Confidence has defined our course and has served as a link between generations. We've always believed in something called progress. We've always had a faith that the days of our children would be better than our own. Our people are losing that faith.
Richard Norton Smith, as we look at our camera walking, it's a live camera inside the museum, walking into a replica of the Oval Office as it looked during Jimmy Carter's time. Why didn't we hear the word malaise in that speech?
Well, that's a sort of an urban legend. It became known as the malaise speech, but you're right, the president never used the word. The word is contained in the original memo from Pat Caddell. That's apparently where it comes from.
Jay Hakes, you've got a couple of memos there when you had a couple of Carter aides who were on opposite sides of whether or not he should even give this speech.
Yeah, we have the memo that Richard referred to from Patrick Caddell. And to put this in context, the United States had gasoline lines again in May and June. We hadn't had gasoline lines since 1974. So a lot of the urgency of this speech traces back to those gasoline lines. And let me just read a little bit here. This is what Caddell wanted President Carter to say. America is a nation deep in crisis. Unlike Civil War or Depression, this crisis, nearly invisible, is unique from those that previously have engaged Americans in their history. Psychological more than material. And then he goes on near the end of this paragraph and says, as they struggle to articulate in concepts the malaise they themselves feel. So Caddell used the word malaise, but President Carter never did. Historians who delve into this will see that there was a huge difference of opinion within the White House staff. I think it's fair to say that Vice President Mondale, Stu Eisenstadt, Hamilton Jordan, and others were not too enthusiastic about the approach that Cadell wanted to take. And so we have another memo over here from Greg Schneiders, and what he says is, the Cadell speech sends all the opposite signals. No one will even be listening after the first 5 minutes, but they'll still be receiving signals. Uncertainty, petulance, softness. It's an interesting academic treatise, but people want Jimmy Carter to do something, to be a president, to be a leader, not to philosophize about it. And of course, what you ended up getting was a speech that had sort of this psychological component to it, and then also had a fair amount of energy left in it. And I went back and looked at the news coverage of the speech. It was interesting. Sam Donaldson and Charles Gibson covered it for ABC. Leslie Stahl was the White House correspondent for CBS. And they really emphasized the energy parts of the speech. But as time went on, I think people remembered the crisis of confidence part of it more, and that's generally how it's remembered today. But the energy parts are really quite powerful.
We have less than 30 minutes left in our series devoted, the night series of the series devoted to the Jimmy Carter Library in Atlanta, Georgia. Jay Hicks, by the way, how many miles from downtown Atlanta? I know it's not very far.
Maybe two miles from downtown Atlanta, so we're a short hop from the interstate, and it's called Freedom Parkway, which we think is a very apt name for the road, because we've got the Martin Luther King Peace Prize and the Carter Peace Prize right on Freedom Parkway. On your screen are the numbers to call. We'll take some more calls here in just a moment. 202 is the area code. You can see the Democrats' line is 737-0001, Republicans 737-0002, and Independent 628-0205. Next subject, the Iran hostage crisis. You're going to see some pictures here of Jimmy Carter's trip to Iran in late 1977. In fact, he spent New Year's Eve in Tehran. We're going to show you part of a speech in a moment. Tell us, Richard Norton Smith, about his relationship with the Shah.
Well, he inherited a long-standing relationship between the United States and the Shah, who in fact owed his throne to the American CIA, which put him there during the Eisenhower administration. And over the years, he'd become a bulwark, a strong ally of the West, but he'd also become increasingly authoritarian and out of touch. I think most people will agree with his own people. In any event, he visited the White House in November of 1977, and just a few weeks later, the Carters returned that visit, and that is why they happened to be in Tehran on New Year's Eve.
Listen to the words of Jimmy Carter on New Year's Eve, 1977, spent with the Shah.
Distinguished leaders of Iran from all walks of life, I'd like to say just a few words tonight in appreciation for your hospitality and the delightful evening that we've already experienced with you. Some have asked why we came to Iran so close behind the delightful visit that we received from the Shah and Empress Farah just a month or so ago. After they left our country, I asked my wife, with whom would you like to spend New Year's Eve? And she said, above all others, I think with the Shah and Empress Farah. So we arranged a trip accordingly and came to be with you. Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. This is a great tribute to you, Your Majesty, and to your leadership, and to the respect and the admiration and love which your people give to you. The transformation that has taken place in this nation is indeed remarkable under your leadership. And as we sat together this afternoon, discussing privately for a few moments what might be done to bring peace to the Middle East, I was profoundly impressed again, not only with your wisdom and your judgment and your sensitivity and insight, but also with the close compatibility that we found in addressing this difficult question. as we visit with leaders who have in their hands the responsibility for making decisions that can bring peace to the Middle East and ensure a peaceful existence for all of us who live in the world, no matter where our nations might be, it's important that we continue to benefit from your sound judgment and from your good advice.
Richard Norton Smith, given what we know now about Jimmy Carter's attitude about leaders of the world, why was he saying those things?
Well, sometimes diplomacy demands too much. I mean, there is an inherent tension in the Carter presidency. It was, it was pointed out at the time, between the real Jimmy Carter, the man who believed passionately in human rights, that American power should be applied sparingly, that our greatest weapons were moral and not military, that we should lead by example in a kind of Wilsonian way, and the president who had to deal in the real world with real alliances and sometimes less than attractive allies.
Time to hear some from our audience. Secaucus, New Jersey, you're on the air.
Yes, this question is for Mr. Smith. I remember that crisis of confidence speech, and I was just wondering, did Carter have an idea as far as economic policies were concerned about a possible tax cut? Because the American people at the time were really hurting, and they didn't want to really be talked down to about confidence and about just basically how bad the American people were acting. And they wanted answers from the Congress and from the President about economic issues, which Reagan successfully exploited during the debates. I was just wondering, did he ever think about tax cuts or supply-side economics during his presidency? Thank you.
Sure. Well, in many ways, it was a speech about confidence that didn't inspire confidence. And you are quite right. The context against which it was given were some of the most severe economic problems in modern times. Some of them due to factors beyond, I think, any president's control. You're right. We had, in the late 70s, double-digit inflation. We had the phenomenon of stagflation, which had really gone back to the Ford years as well, or even to the Nixon. And then we had the highest interest rates, I believe, in American history. So all of this came into play. And you're right. There were an awful lot of people who I think took umbrage at listening to their president. They thought implicitly point a finger of blame at them for these increasingly difficult problems.
Springfield, Illinois, good evening.
Yes, I've read where presidents are required to plan their funerals, and I was wondering if you could discuss what plans President Carter had, and specifically whether he planned to be buried at the library or at Plains. Thank you.
Jay Hakes, it's right down your alley.
Yes, he has said publicly that he will be buried in Plains.
Any plans for the funeral itself? I mean, these are not fun things to talk about, but I assume you've talked about it.
Well, I think we can always assume that the Army has good plans in place, and that it will be handled as other funerals have been handled, but we think that's pretty far off in our planning. But the Carters always have had this incredible attachment to Plains going back many, many generations, and so that was why that decision was made.
Lancaster, Pennsylvania, good evening.
Good evening. I was actually born 31 years ago tomorrow, which is the date which I researched that President Carter, it was announced he had won the presidency. And me being from the hometown of Gerald Ford, I was going to ask about the final resting place for President Carter, but since that's been answered, I'm wondering if you can tell me what type of items are currently coming into the presidential library from the current days of President Carter.
Jay Hakes?
Well, our most recent finding what was very exciting because we were going through the estate of his aunt and found a diary that his mother, Miss Lillian, had kept when she was in the Peace Corps in India. For those who aren't aware of that situation, she was in the Peace Corps in India at the age of 70, maybe the model for President Carter being active into old age. So you can imagine our delight when we found that diary. Things like we've had tonight, like we refer to Iowa. Tim Kraft, who is the organizer in Iowa, donated his papers to us from that campaign. And then, of course, there's all the work of the Carter Center. President Carter, whenever he travels, writes a trip report. So all the reports, trips he's taken over the years working for the Carter Center, there will be full archives on those trips. So we're not through writing history yet.
Eastman, Georgia, you're on the air.
Hi, this is a question for Jay Hakes. I was wondering what President and Mrs. Carter are doing these days with the Carter Center, how they spend their time, and what is their role at the Carter Center?
Well, President and Mrs. Carter are the founders of the Carter Center. For a long time, they were the chairman and the vice chairman. They have relinquished that role, but I haven't seen any diminution in the time they spend on the Carter Center. This is their love, everything from the internship program to the election monitoring to the efforts to try to get rid of guinea worm. Another thing that we haven't mentioned tonight is that when the Carters were in the White House, Mrs. Carter devoted a lot of her time to the mental health issue and issued some reports that helped turn around thinking on mental health and making less of a stigmatized situation and more of a health issue. And the Carter Center today, under her guidance, is very active in the mental health area.
Kings Mountain, North Carolina. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was curious if there was any basis to the allegations that the CIA had any role in keeping the hostages imprisoned until after the 1980 election.
Richard Norton Smith, answer that, please, and then introduce the next segment, which is from April 25th of 1980.
No. 1980, of course, is an election year, and in some ways, I think the frustration that the president and those around him felt regarding the continuing captivity of the hostages is summed up in a tragically unfortunate rescue attempt in April of 1980. Very complicated in terms of logistics, with helicopters and planes having to reconnoiter some distance from Tehran. Very, very challenging operation. And almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
This is about 2 minutes.
I ordered this rescue mission prepared in order to safeguard American lives, to protect America's national interest, and to reduce the tensions in the world that have been caused among many nations as this crisis has continued. It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. It was my decision to cancel it when problems developed in the placement of our rescue team for a future rescue operation. The responsibility is fully my own. In the aftermath of the attempt, we continue to hold the government of Iran responsible for the safety and for the early release of the American hostages who have been held so long. The United States remains determined to bring about their safe release at the earliest date possible. As President, I know that our entire nation feels a deep gratitude, I feel, for the brave men who were prepared to rescue their fellow Americans from captivity. And as President, I also know that the nation shares not only my disappointment that the rescue effort could not be mounted because of mechanical difficulties, but also my determination to persevere and to bring all of our hostages home to freedom. We have been disappointed before. We will not give up in our efforts. Throughout this extraordinarily difficult period, we have pursued and will continue to pursue every possible avenue to secure the release of the hostages. In these efforts, the support of the American people and of our friends throughout the world has been a most crucial element. That support of other nations is even more important now. We will seek to continue, along with other nations and with the officials of Iran, a prompt resolution of the crisis without any loss of life and through peaceful and diplomatic means. Thank you very much.
President Carter's remarks on April 25th, 1980, after the mission to rescue American hostages held in Tehran failed. The camera angle looked a bit different from what you're used to seeing when a president speaks from the Oval Office. That's because it was shot by the Navy film crew, which is why you're able to also see something beyond the president's final words there as he leaves the desk and goes off to the side and leaves the Oval Office. Richard Smith, this failure of this mission, did it hurt Jimmy Carter's re-election bid?
I think in the sense, well, two things, I think. One, in a practical sense, it made it even more unlikely that the hostages would be released before Election Day in 1980. And beyond that, and perhaps even more significantly, I think it became a metaphor for a lot of people about this situation, and as has often been said, about a country that in effect was held hostage. If you were not alive then, it is hard to imagine now the degree to which this incident, tragic as it was, came to define American politics and even America's self-image during 1980.
These are photos from the library and museum in Atlanta, and San Antonio, Texas is our next call. Go ahead, please.
President Carter is the first of this series to feature a living president, and I have a couple of quick questions. There are some rumors that President Carter lobbied for the Nobel Peace Prize. Is there anything in the archives to substantiate or refute this claim? But a general question, are ex-presidents required to submit or volunteer post-presidential materials? We've seen the series, for example, Truman and Ford voluntarily adding to the archives. Thank you very much.
Jay Hakes, did President Carter lobby for the Nobel Peace Prize?
I'm quite certain that he didn't. I actually was with him the night before it was announced at a town meeting in Plains. I was down there for some meetings the next day, and he gave no indication he was even thinking about it. And when I woke up the next morning, turned on the television, lo and behold, he had won the prize. I think he was informed by one of his Secret Service agents about 4 in the morning. The other issue was post-presidential papers. Actually, when Carter was president, it wasn't even required by law that presidents turn over their papers. It was done voluntarily by most presidents as a deed of gift. Now it is required of presidents. It's voluntary for the post-presidency era, but I think most presidents would tend to turn that over. Certainly in our case, we're getting all the materials that we want on what the Carters have done after leaving the White House, and it'll be an important part of our collection.
Petillion, Nebraska, you're on.
Yes, as a young engineer, I was involved with the energy program back in the Carter years, and I've often thought what a different world this would be geopolitically if Reagan would have continued the research and development in energy conservation that Carter started. Your comments, please?
Mr. Smith.
It's an interesting argument, and no doubt many people would agree with you. Ronald Reagan used to talk about the magic of the marketplace, the notion that free market economics held the solution to virtually any problem. And I think it's fair to say that that was the approach followed during the Reagan presidency and thereafter. But 30 years later, here we are, talking again about the need for conservation.
About 10 minutes left in our program on Jimmy Carter. Mark Farkas, our executive producer for all these programs. We have 3 libraries to go. Let's go to Danvers, Massachusetts. You're on the air.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. Excellent program tonight. I'd like to ask Mr. Hakes about the role that Jimmy Carter played in the development of the stealth bomber. It seems that he does not get much credit for that, but my understanding is that he did have some involvement in that development.
Thanks.
Well, this was a very important new weapon system that Harold Brown, the Secretary of Defense, had been working on, and it was going to be an important part of the battle to win the Cold War. Carter couldn't use it politically, however, because it was his patriotic duty to keep the development secret. So on the one hand, he was being criticized for cutting back on the B-1 bomber while he was developing a much more potent system that he couldn't release. So it was another one of these issues where there was a conflict between what was good politics and what was good for the country, and he chose to develop the stealth bomber and to not announce it.
Ann Arbor, Michigan. Good evening.
Yes, my question is, I read somewhere that a number of congressmen or congresspersons lobbied President Carter during his term to sign the Martin Luther King Day holiday, and he refused to do it. In fact, it wasn't signed until Ronald Reagan became president. Is that true?
Jay Hakes?
I don't remember that specifically. I know that President Carter was the one who signed the legislation establishing the Martin Luther King Historic Site here in Atlanta, but I think in, I don't remember the position in the 70s. The caller may be right. I'm not sure.
Mr. Smith?
Yeah, I recall only because I wrote Bob Dole's speech. He was floor manager for the bill. Before you could have the holiday, you had to have legislation passed by Congress. And that actually happened during the Reagan presidency. I cannot for a moment believe that President Carter, given his long, very personal association with the King family, as well as the cause of civil rights, would have opposed a King holiday.
Marshall, Texas, you're on.
Hi, I seem to remember in one of the debates, Carter said that he had asked his daughter Amy about important issues, and she's talking about nuclear war and things like that. What was he thinking when he said that, and what does that say about his thought process and his psyche? You know, listen off the air. Thank you.
Jay Hicks.
Well, if you go back and read President Carter's memoirs, you will see that there was a very strong emphasis on controlling nuclear weapons. He knew a lot about nuclear energy, and this was a strong thrust. He worked very hard to try to get SALT II ratified, and then that, of course, didn't happen because the relations with the Russians deteriorated. And I'm sure this was something he discussed with his family. Even today, the nuclear non-proliferation issue is one that he's very committed to.
Fulton, Texas, you're on.
Yes, good evening.
Hi.
I was wondering, I was one of the hostages in Iran, and did Carter or didn't he come over to Germany to see us guys when we got out?
Well, let me ask you, sir, what's your name?
Oh, Gary Lee is my name.
And how long were you held hostage?
Oh, the whole time, 444 days.
And you don't remember whether he came to Germany?
No, I recall him being there. I recall him coming in. Remember, it was a bedlam in those days. But I think he came over and visited with us personally in a room. Some of us were there. Some of us were having medical checks and all that other stuff.
Well, hold on just a second.
Sure.
Let's go back to that photo we'll put on the screen there from January 22nd, 1981.
Well, I can't see it. I'm in another room.
Yeah, it's in West Germany. Richard Smith?
Yes, he did. As a matter of fact, the new president, Ronald Reagan, asked him if he would go to Germany, where the hostages had been relocated for medical attention if necessary. And after a very brief stop in planes, after the inauguration, that's where both the Carters went.
By the way, caller, what did you do about the history of your experience? Did you do an oral history on it?
I did a oral history with some fellow that wrote it up in a book. I never did anything else with it. But no, I was correct then.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. We have this important piece of videotape. It's 5 minutes and 27 seconds long. What is it?
It's extraordinary. It's what ought to have been, in many ways, joyous moment at the climax of the Clinton, forgive me, Freudian slip, Carter presidency, and in fact is one more in a series of frustrations. On January 16th, 4 days before the inauguration, a basic deal had been agreed upon, and it hinged on President Carter, in effect, unfreezing about $8 billion in Iranian assets. That was an incredibly complicated series of procedures with many banks around the world. Anyway, one delay after another took place. And so here we are on Inauguration Day morning. The President is in the Oval Office hoping that before high noon and the end of his presidency that the hostages will be free.
Jay Hicks, we're running out of time, but set up the Jody Powell, Ham Jordan, Lloyd Cutler, Gary Sick. Who were they?
Well, Gary Sick was his advisor on the National Security Council on Iran. Lloyd Cutler was the general counsel. Jody Powell, as you learned, was the press secretary. You see Walter Mondale in the room. Phil Wise, his appointment secretary, is in the room. And they're waiting for the deal to come to fruition.
Let's watch.
That is good. Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, we've gotten word through another country that that Nabob in Iran, has stated he stated at 8:13 this morning that he would inform them when the plane leaves. So I presume that is the first message we've had from Iran, that the plane will be leaving.
You want this office?
NSA out. The time is getting close. Yes. All right. No. I got it. Both planes are at the end of the runway. See you later.
Another glitch.
Both planes at the end of the runway.
Do we know if the presumption the hostages are on?
Don't know.
Don't know.
If those planes take off empty, I'm going to be upset. Mr. President. All right. Governor, good morning. How you doing? I placed a call for it earlier. I just want to let you know that the planes are at the end of the runway. That's right. That's what we presume. And all the money was cleared and the Iranians were notified about roughly 25 minutes ago, about 8:05. And so we'll let you know when to take off, but that's close. We're very proud. Got a lot of good teams. I'm gonna restrict my group going over to Germany only to the ones who have been intimately and deeply involved in the Iranian question, because everybody wants to go. So I just thought I'd tell you that, so you know if anybody asks you. Good luck to you, and thank you very much. I'll see you later on for the ceremonies. God bless you. Thank you, sir. Bye. They're already 25 minutes later than...
Were you speaking to Chris before?
No, I was speaking to Bill.
Would it be unseemly for him to call the guy directly?
You mean Richardson?
Yeah. Sir, Gordon.
They only got an hour before it's dark. And we don't have any...
Do we know what's going on?
Well, Chris said it would take them about 15 minutes because they were calling off each.
But that was it. That was a quarter after. According to Chris's schedule, they should have had the certification at 7:30.
It's puzzling because I can't conceive of what the items were. They have so many dollars.
But would you rather use the barbershop downstairs?
There are other securities.
They've already checked off all the sums.
Did Bill say that? Did Miller say they were worried about the wording?
Yeah, that's what he told me. I don't know if he's joking or not.
Unbelievable. With all these hours, they wouldn't have that thing ready just to punch out.
It is.
No. Automatic.
You've got a security call.
It's leaving, correct? McMahon, okay. Huh?
What did you say?
I said they're typing the thing out. They've had it now for an hour and a half. Hour. In Algiers. He refuses to talk to Bill Miller. McMahon.
Who is he?
He's a deputy governor.
Oh, boy.
who's in Algeria in charge of delivering the certification.
Looks like the Secretary of the Treasury.
No, I may not talk to you, but see. Come on, we get a haircut. Okay.
Quick comment, Richard Norton Smith.
Well, of course, what's going on is, along with the incompetence in some cases of the banks, is the spitefulness of the Iranians. They were determined that the hostages were not going to be released on Jimmy Carter's watch, and literally within moments of Ronald Reagan's being sworn into office, the planes finally took off.
Jay Hakes, we are out of time, but you have something new there in the form of a diary from one of the hostages.
Yeah, this is almost like a sacred piece of paper because Robert Odie, who is the oldest of the hostages, kept a diary during the entire period, and his widow gave it to us, which we are very privileged to have. And I'll just read a very brief section. December 9th, 1980, 402nd day. Was told again this morning there would be no hot water today, possibly tomorrow, because there was no oil. He said, if I could be sure Iran is really hurting, I would be glad to do without the hot water. So he was one of a number of hostages who, when they were there, wished that stronger action had been taken. But when they got back, they realized that very strict economic sanctions had been placed on Iran. No concessions were made to get them back, and also that they all came back alive. So what we found over the years is the hostages, I think, have come to appreciate the approach that was taken, and President Carter was very thankful that they all got out alive.
Jay Hakes, thank you and your team for all the help you gave us down there at the Carter Museum, Library, and Carter Center. Hope to come back and see you again soon. And also to Russell Logan, who was our Carter program producer. Last comments, and you only have 15 seconds.
You bet. Jimmy Carter changed how you run for president. He rewrote the rule book on how to be a former president. And by grasping the need for the Democratic Party to become centrist, post-New Deal, in effect to redefine liberalism, he was a man ahead of his time.
Thank you, Richard Norton Smith, and Ronald Reagan's Library. And look at the new stuff we can find there next week here on our 10th of 12 in a series.
Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered. Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered visits the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta, Georgia, and explores the life and career of our 39th president.
That is good. Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, we've gotten word through another country that that Nabab in Iran has stated that he stated at 8:13 this morning that he would inform them when the plane leaves. So I presume that is the first message we've had from Iran, that the plane will be leaving.
President Jimmy Carter on his last morning in office.
For more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries.